This is a DSLR. This is a mirrorless camera. It's August 2024. So which of these two camera types should you go for? Hello there everybody, how are you all doing today? I hope you're all keeping well, hope you're all keeping safe. So let's just get right into it, shall we? Let's just get into the age-old question that has been asked for the past few years. Which camera type should you go for? A digital SLR or a mirrorless camera? Now, I've worked within the photography industry for so many years now, and it's a question I'm asked every single day. So I wanted to spend today's video just talking about the key differences between these two camera types, and hopefully by the end of this video it'll help you if you've been deciding which one to actually go for, if you've been planning to upgrade or make a switch between any of these two. Hopefully it'll help you decide which one to go for at the end of this. Now, you'll be glad to know I'm not going into tech specs or anything heavy duty in this video. I just want to give a general description and some layman terms about these two different camera types. So we'll start off with the DSLR. DSLR just stands for digital single lens reflex. It carries over from the old film days where it was just SLR, single lens reflex. Now we have the digital version. We have an interchangeable lens camera where to get your photograph, light travels in through your lens, hits the mirror on the inside, so this mirrored prism on here, and it bounces off into your viewfinder, so that way you get to see what you're doing looking through the viewfinder. Then take your photograph, this mirror has to flip out of the way, your shutter opens, light gets exposed to the sensor, then it closes over, boom, you have your photograph. Mirrorless cameras on the other hand work pretty much the exact same way. The only real difference is, anyone want to take a guess? Yep, that's right, it's mirrorless. So to get your still, light travels in through the lens, there's no mirrored prism on the inside, it just goes straight to the sensor and it's all digitally processed. You still have a viewfinder on here as well. It's going to be electronic compared to an optical style with the DSLR, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So yeah, mirrored prism on the inside, no mirror at all. So if one has a mirrored prism and one doesn't, then what exactly is the big deal? What exactly is the biggest differences overall? Well, let's get talking about it. And you're probably already looking at the biggest difference overall between these two cameras, and that's size and weight. Now, we all recognize DSLRs. Anytime we see a professional photographer out and about, they're always carrying this big clunky box of technology, and that's what they are, a big clunky box of technology. You've got a nice size grip on here, the camera feels sturdy, the camera feels nice and heavy, and that can be the downside there. It's big and it's heavy, especially if you put a good lens on it, because the camera is only as good as whatever lens you put onto it. If I have a telephoto on here, it's going to get so much bigger, bulkier and heavier. Do I want to carry around something like that with me all day, every day? Some people do, others don't. That's why we're finding people are moving over to mirrorless, because you're taking away a lot of different parts like the mirrored prism, so on and so forth. You have a much more lighter weight camera. And then again, the benefit with mirrorless is the lenses are getting smaller, lighter, compact. In the early days with mirrorless, it was never really that good, and that was why a lot of people weren't moving over, because they were a bit too small and probably felt a wee bit gimmicky, whereas now they've gotten a lot more grippier. They have gotten a wee bit bigger, but compared to one of these guys, I would want to carry this about with me all day, every day. I've been traveling about with something like this, and it is so much handier. Now that Canon and Nikon have also started moving over to mirrorless, Canon have the RF system. Their cameras have gotten smaller, lighter, compact. Their lenses have gotten smaller, lighter, compact. So again, that's where the biggest pro with going to mirrorless is having just a smaller camera body. May take a bit of getting used to if this is what you've been with for all your photography career, but size and weight has gotten just so much better with mirrorless. Next, I want to talk about shutter and frames per second. So inside both of these cameras, there is a mechanical shutter inside. So that's where you take your photograph, you hear this clunky noise going on. Well, that's your shutter inside opening and closing. So it opens up to let light in and it closes over so it protects your sensor that way. And you can have this open for quite a long period of time or quite a short period of time. I do talk about playing with shutter speed in a separate video, which you can check somewhere up in this vicinity and what all it does for your photography. But yeah, both of these have a mechanical shutter you can have open for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time. And that's where we also then need to think about different types of photography, like for me with music photography, or if you're a sport, wildlife, wedding photographer, you need to have a camera that's going to take quite a lot of photos all at the one time. Both of these cameras have quite a high frame rate on them. I think the 5D4 was up to about 10 frames per second on the mechanical. The A7C Mark II also has that as well. But where this has a benefit on is silent shutter. With less moving parts in here, you don't have your mirror prism or anything like that in the way, but you can also turn on using the electronic shutter. That's where you don't hear or feel this door opening and closing. Your image just goes straight to the sensor, so that means you have a much more silent, a much more quieter setup compared to something like this where it's going to be constantly clunky and noisy. So say you're at a wedding, you're in a very like private moment and you don't want to cause any noise, well you're going to hear this from either the front or the back of the room. Whereas something like this, I can turn on to electronic shutter and it's completely silent. Another benefit with going to the likes of electronic shutters, you actually get a lot more frames per second. So there are cameras out there that give you at least 10 to 12 frames per second on mechanical shutter, but they'll give you about 30 to 40 plus frames per second on the electronic shutter, which is absolutely crazy. Like take for example the Sony A9 Mark III. It doesn't have a mechanical shutter or anything like that. It has what's known as a global shutter. That camera can shoot up to 120 frames per second, which is absolutely ridiculous, which something like this would just explode with that amount of frames. Next, I want to talk about viewfinders and a little bit about exposure reading on both of these cameras. So with a DSLR, again with the mirrored prism, your light bounces off into the mirror and goes up into your OVF or your optical viewfinder. Whereas a mirrorless camera, it's all digitally processed, so your light goes just straight to the sensor and you have an EVF, which is an electronic viewfinder. Big benefit with staying with an OVF is it's just a much more natural feeling. So there's no digital processing or anything like that going on. Studio photographers will probably use them a little bit more. Low light photographers will probably use them a little bit more because again, with that natural feeling and with some of the digital processing, it can be quite hard in a studio environment with an EVF. There is ways around to get that fixed, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but just that more natural feel means you're just seeing what actually is there. Biggest downside with having it all optically is if you have set up your exposure, you start taking your photographs, say your photograph is too overexposed or underexposed, you don't really know that until you've taken the photo. So you take your shot, you look at the back of the screen and go, oh, everything is all over the place. So then you go and take your photograph, you play with your settings, you take a photograph. That would just be quite time consuming. Even in a wedding environment, you don't have that much time to do all these things. Whereas an EVF, on the other hand, the biggest benefit of all is that you get live exposure, both in the viewfinder and on the rear screen. So if you were playing about with your exposure, whether you're brightening or darkening, like say on this camera here, this is a mirrorless camera I'm working with, the Sony ZV-E1. If I was to brighten up this video, say, if I raise up my ISO, you see the video is brightening up. If I'm then going down the ways, if I underexpose my shot, it's getting darker. But I'm actually seeing that happen in real time. I'm looking at the screen right now of me doing that. It's just I can see it there, so I can balance out my shot. Then you have the downside of having an EVF is, again, not a lot of people like looking through a digital screen. Some of these viewfinders can be quite low quality. To then have something at a higher end quality, you're having to spend big money, where they're going to have a lot more pixels and a much bigger viewfinder. Like, I don't mind the viewfinder on the A7C II, but I don't really use it all that much. It is a wee bit low quality, whereas I would have to move up to say something like the A7R5 or the A9 Mark III to have a really high quality, but then I'm going into about 4, 5, 6 grand of a camera there. Things like studio photography and low light, it is a wee bit harder, especially with studio photography, because you have to turn off the live exposure. You have to make sure that you do that, because if you walk into a studio, you're just going to get absolute pure black in your shot, so you have to turn off the live exposure, which adds a little bit of time here, especially if you're then trying to hunt through your settings, but it's not the end of the world. So you're really balancing between if you want the sort of natural optical style or the digital. For me, I just love having that live exposure. It just saves so much time. Now we're going to come to the nitty gritty. Now we're going to come to the biggest differences between these two types, and that is all about autofocus. Both of these cameras have autofocus. That's where if you hold the shutter button down halfway, you might hear you beep. Then you take your photograph. That means your photograph has just gotten nicely in focus. It's nice and sharp. With the DSLR, there is a separate box just above the mirror prism, which is your autofocus box. So that's where you can select where you want your focus point to be, is going left, right, up and down. Whereas the mirrorless, you don't have this autofocus box. Again, it's all digitally processed through the sensor. Now, having been a mirrorless fan for so many years now, this is where DSLRs kind of lose it for me, and this is where it's really the biggest losing battle on owning something like this, and that is the autofocus. You were always limited to what autofocus points you had to the focus box. Most of these could have gone up to about 50, 60 autofocus points, and it was all within the sort of center of the frame. You could still go left, right, up and down, but you were kind of tied to a certain area of where you wanted your points to be. Whereas a mirrorless camera, on the other hand, because it's all going to the sensor, you're going from roughly 50 to 60 autofocus points to, say, 7, 8, over 1,000 autofocus points, where it's not just staying within the center of the frame, it's going all over the sensor. So you can go left, right, up, down, even into the far corners, and still be able to get something in focus, which is crazy. Mirrorless cameras have now brought in is face, eye, and subject detection. That's where, say for example, like me here recording myself, again using a mirrorless camera, I have face and eye detection on, and the autofocus is just locked. Like right now it's locked onto this eye, and if I'm moving about, it'll keep a track. It's just effortless. As phase detections and all those different things move along, AI coming into cameras now, we have much more better subject detection, like again for face portraits. We also have animal, birds, wildlife, planes, trains, automobiles, where the camera just recognizes what subject is coming to a frame, and it just locks straight away onto that subject without getting distracted too much. So yeah, that was as great as autofocus and all like that was on SLRs. It's just nothing compared to what's on a mirrorless camera. Now, where DSLRs are going to stand out a lot better is with battery life. So both these cameras do have a pretty powerful battery, but because there's less digital processing and all that going on an SLR, means that battery life is a lot better. It's a lot more longer lasting. You know, without the digital viewfinders and all that in here, it's much more manageable. Whereas on a mirrorless camera, because you're all digitalized, you have your EVFs and all that, it will eat into your battery life a little bit more. So that really is the biggest con to mirrorless. Batteries were absolutely atrocious. Like when I was on the A7 and the A7 II, that battery, the NP-FW50 or whatever the heck you call it, was an atrocious battery. Whereas now they're on the FZ100 battery, it is better, it's double the lifespan, but it just is nothing compared to an SLR on battery life. Finally, I just wanted to talk about something that I don't see many people talk about in videos, and that is longevity. With an SLR, because they have been around for so long, and that companies like Nikon and Canon are now moving over to mirrorless, what you will find is with getting an SLR, you're more at a risk of there being less parts available for repairs, because companies aren't manufacturing these as much anymore. Like, this is probably one of the only few digital SLRs that is still in production to this day. It's probably going to be another year until this is discontinued. But even then, like older DSLRs, parts and repairs are just basically becoming non-existent because it's just so hard to get, and that companies are only really focusing on mirrorless cameras for repairs. Think about a year, think about 2 years, think about 5 years down the line. Where are you going to be? Are you going to just have an expensive paperweight, or are you going to have something that's still supported to this day? But again, there's so many other things that we could talk about as well. We could spend all night talking about differences like stabilization. To get stabilization in a DSLR, you had to get it all through the lens, whereas a mirrorless camera, some of them give you stabilization within the camera. So that way you have it all there, plus you also have it within the lens, so that way you have a better chance of getting a much more stable shot. You've also got video differences. I mean, it's night and day. DSLRs were never really the best for video. Like, the 5D4 could still shoot 4K, but it was never really that good. It was quite heavily cropped, whereas mirrorless is, you know, these are just video machines now. 4K, 8K, all these high resolutions. It's total night and day. Probably have heard a little bit of a theme throughout this video and a little bit more of a bias that I do sway more to mirrorless, but I think the pros outweigh the cons of having a mirrorless over a DSLR. But I mean, it's all entirely up to yourself. I know many photographers that still hang on to theirs, love them, swear by them. There is nothing wrong with going to something like this, because again, you want to think about what you want to carry about with you all day, every day. Not a lot of people like the small lightweightness. Not a lot of people like the fact that, you know, the camera does basically everything for you. Some people like the more natural feel. Some people like the more bigger style body. Everybody is different. That's what's so good about this industry. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Are you still a die-hard DSLR user, or have you moved over to mirrorless, or are you on the fence between the two and which one to go for? Let me know in the comments, and while you're at it, don't be afraid to like, share, subscribe. Hit that wee bell icon so you can stay up to date with future videos. It's always greatly appreciated that you come out and check out the content. But until then, folks, do take care of yourselves and enjoy the rest of your day.